Good morning. My name is Josh Pennard. I'm running for Senate in the 2nd Legislative District. That's Yelm, Roy, McKenna, Rainier, Spanaway, Graham, and then all the way around the mountain. I'm answering this questionnaire for the Arc of Washington. This is a legislative questionnaire for candidates. It's specific to questions around intellectual and developmental disabilities, something that I have a lot of experience working with, through, and for. I'm going to answer the 4 questions to the best of my ability right here for you on video. I'm going to make sure it's closed caption so you can read what I'm saying, and I'm going to answer them in a text version as well for those of you who digest information best through text rather than video. The first question is, if you have personal connection or professional experience with someone who has a developmental disability, would you describe its impact on you? Absolutely, and I have both. Let's start with personal impact. My wife Patricia and I, we have 3 children, Matthew who's 10, Luke who's 8, and Anna who's 2 years old. 2 of those 3, Matthew and Luke, have very profound disabilities, both intellectual and physical disabilities. Matthew is autistic. We discovered he was autistic when he was about 2 years old, and we got him into the early intervention programs we were able to. The path of his autism has been a challenge at times, but it's also helped us grow closer as a family. Right now, he does receive DDA services. He has ABA therapy 5 times a week. He has multiple therapists. He has an education plan through the school district. We work very closely with the district's director of special needs services. And through that conversation, I'm going to share with you some important things that I've learned as a community leader. My second child, Luke was born with a severe brain injury, and that led to cerebral palsy. Luke is very physically disabled. Intellectually, he's at his peer level or near peer level. He's a very bright child, but he's nonverbal, so he utilizes a communication device to speak and utilizes a wheelchair to move about. And it's not self-propelled yet. Right now, we push it around, but we're working towards self-propelled wheelchair. And I have a lot of experience as a community leader working towards making our community more accessible for folks like Luke. And if Luke is in the same position as you are watching this video, folks like you as well. So personal level, I live a life every single day that is impacted a lot by intellectual and physical disabilities of my children, and the challenges that we have as a family supporting them both in their daily living but also in their goals to accomplish in life, identifying those goals, figuring out how to make it happen. Now professionally, now I'm the mayor of the city of Ording. Ording is a city of about 8,500 people in Pierce County, and we don't have a huge tax base, but we're very conscious about where we spend our money. And that is to say that adding in big capital projects to improve our city is a very challenging idea, right? And regardless of what the reason is, whether it's traffic or accessibility, it's very challenging to move ahead. Some of the things that we've done in the last couple of years, I'm very proud of. And it's been done through my direction as the mayor of Ording. Just this last year, we worked closely with the school district and with community agencies to bring on what we call a supported employment employee. And this is a young gentleman who worked through the school district, is aging out of his support at the school district, but we are able to provide a job at the city for him that's kind of scaffolded. We have the ability to work with a community agency to have somebody go around with the young man and help him understand the job at his own pace. And how this benefits us as a city and as an employer of this young man is that we are able to help somebody become self-sufficient that otherwise might not be self-sufficient. And how this helps him, right? It helps him be self-sufficient, and it helps us by getting tasks that we otherwise would have needed to get done. And so there's a great connection, great ability for us to work with folks, work with our school district, work with local community agencies to bring on folks and provide them employment in a supported type situation. So professionally, that's something we've been working on. Other things that we've been working on in the city is recreation, the ability to have recreation for all abilities, whether somebody's in a wheelchair or uses a walker or crutches or any other type of mobility device. We want to make sure that there are robust recreation opportunities available for them. And that's been a goal of my administration as well. In fact, this last year, we were able to dedicate funding for parks. And it's my intent as I leave the city to go into the Senate, and even at the Senate, to make sure that if public projects are, or if parks projects are funded by public monies, that there is some amount of that that must be dedicated to use of facilities by all mobilities. And there already is some of that language in law, right? As far as accessibility, there has to be paths and things like that. But one thing that I've learned is that just because something is ADA accessible doesn't mean it's functionally usable. We could talk about parks equipment. Just because something's ADA accessible doesn't mean it's functionally usable by all abilities. So a great deal of exposure to the realm of disabilities, great deal of experience advocating for common sense solutions and inclusiveness in the disability discussion. And I hope this helps you to understand that as a candidate, this is a specific topic that's very near and dear to my heart. It's not something that I'm going to tell you that I believe in and then go home at the end of the day and say, oh man, they heard what I said and we'll see if they come back again. This is something that I live every single day, right? So item 2, what are your top 3 legislative priorities and how would you help people with developmental disabilities in them? Well, my top legislative priorities are budget, public safety, family, right? And sometimes it's hard to say what specific policy issues are going to fit within these giant umbrella ideas. But I can talk specifically about all 3, I think. If we're talking budget is going to be, budget's always the biggest subject of any legislative session, and it probably should be. That's the purpose of the legislature, is to pass laws and to pass budgets. And what we're going to see this next year and these next couple years is all of the oxygen in the room is going to be taken up by the budget discussion. We're looking right now at a budget that is going to be severely impacted by the reduced commerce in this state. And also probably the reduced income in this state. And folks are going to be less likely to be open to all sorts of things, whether it's charities, voting for new taxes, whatever you want to do to provide those additional resources. Folks are going to be a little bit hesitant to buy into it because they aren't sure where their income's coming from. And I think that's completely reasonable. So how am I going to help folks with developmental disabilities in my advocacy for a smart budget in this next legislative session? I would leave it to the fact that, we've got education is our main priority. Add to that public safety. Both of those have significant disability pieces, right? Education, fundamental education needs to be provided to all students in the state. There's no part of that language that says all able-bodied or able-minded students or those that only excel, right? That conversation needs to apply equally to every student in this state. A fundamental, basic, good education. And so as I'm advocating for funding education and supporting education, I'm certainly going to be advocating for funding and supporting education for those that are disabled. I will say on a personal note, I do believe that maybe those impacted the most by this coronavirus situation is the students that receive disability services through the school districts and have things like para-educators and have that scaffolded support to help them get them through the day. I think about my son, Luke, who's nonverbal, uses a communication device and has very little access to education outside of that environment. And so while he's home with us, it makes it incredibly challenging to provide a good education. And he doesn't have the ability to raise his hand and say, I need more help. We have to work with him one-on-one. And it's heartbreaking to me that I know that there's 150,000 other kids across the state that are in the same situation. They're a silent group because maybe there's nobody there to advocate for them. But they are very much impacted by this situation. Public safety is another piece. I can tell you my son, Matthew, my son with autism, he's an escape artist. He has engaged the services of our police department many times. He has gotten out of the house, he strips down, and he has run through the community without any clothes on. Public safety is a pivotal part of the conversation of raising these beautiful young children into adults and then supporting them into adulthood. There is no point in time that police should not understand how to work with folks with significant intellectual and developmental disabilities. That being said, police officers are not social workers. Police officers are not healthcare professionals. Police officers and public safety agents don't live the lives that maybe some of us that live with these people every day live. So what's important, I think, is that police receive adequate funding for training and exposure. Now, I've worked closely with the police departments across the state as part of the crisis intervention training curriculum. So I'm an instructor at the Criminal Justice Training Center and as part of the CIT curriculum. And part of that focuses on connecting with folks who have certain disabilities when they're in moments of crisis. And I think that's been very successful. I'd say the one drawback is that funding for that training is often left to individual jurisdictions, and individual communities usually spend 60% or more of their budget just on public safety as is. And so adding more training without adding adequate funding for the training only serves to reduce the number of staff that you actually have doing the job because there's a limited amount of funding. So at the state level, as I talk about budgeting and as I talk about public safety, I think that there's a very close tie in there, and supporting those with intellectual and developmental disabilities needs to be part of that conversation. So that way, as we add more tools to our public safety officers' belts, we also add the funding necessary to afford those tools. And then the last piece is family. The most important advocate for anybody with a disability is family. And they need to be empowered to make those to make those statements, right? Whether it's provided the right language to go talk to the local superintendent of education, or maybe provide a forum for folks to come down to the legislature in Olympia during session to speak about specific items and bills and information. Family needs to be informed and they need to be supported, and that needs to continue. I think about that every year I have to certify that my children continue to have disabilities, which to me seems a little awkward, but that's fine. I have to certify it to the state. What that looks like is it looks like me calling a phone number at the state and waiting on hold for 2 hours. And about 60% of the time, that phone hangs up. It just hangs up and I have to start the process all over again. And I have to do this over the course of a couple days. And if I don't do it, my kids don't continue to be certified as disabled. So they lose some of their support through the DDA. And it's just a big bureaucratic mess. So that is not supporting families. That's supporting a state apparatus that some would argue helps families, but in many cases hurts families that maybe don't have the ability that I have to wait on hold. And so that is the third part, right? Budget. Make sure that we have adequate funding in all areas. Public safety, make sure we have training that's supported by adequate funding. And family, make sure that families are able to best advocate and have good advocates and are supported in their own advocacy of their own children as they grow older. So with the current economic crisis, how would you protect services that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families need? Well, every family that supports somebody with these needs has a different constellation of requirements. I can talk about both my children that both need OT and speech, and one needs PT, right? But they need vastly different strategies in each. And you can't compare any two folks that have intellectual or developmental disabilities and say, okay, well, these two fit into this category. It just doesn't make sense. So how would I protect services that those folks need? I think it really comes down to what I spoke about just before. One is protect the funding stream, and maybe one is breaking down some of the bureaucracy. I think we get a little too pigeonholed in trying to classify every little piece of this discussion, and not empower families to be a little bit better advocates for their own needs, for their children and maybe their adult children. So is there other information you'd like constituents with developmental disabilities and their families and friends to know? I've spoken a lot in this conversation about helping those that are younger with developmental disabilities. But to me, I think this needs to be a whole life discussion. Just because we're able to support them with more medical procedures early on or early intervention doesn't mean that their ongoing life discussion gets better necessarily, right? We need to make sure that we also focus on transitioning out of that support when they're 21. What happens when folks transition into adulthood? What's that conversation look like? Do we have the pieces in place or the state funding to support local agencies like we've done in Ording to provide jobs that are meaningful, not just jobs that do busy work, but jobs that actually provide meaning and value to both the community and the person doing the job. Do we have that support? And then as folks age into their older years, what are we doing to support them as their family starts to pass away, right? As a parent of two disabled children, what is going to happen to my children when I'm not around anymore? And that's something that we think about constantly. It's part of our family's mental health and our family's mental health challenges. It becomes a big part of our life, and we wonder what's going to happen later on. So we need to have a whole life discussion around this topic, and not just a discussion of the early years or the transition years into adulthood, but the entire life of a person with an intellectual and developmental disability. And what kind of scaffolds can we put into that to make sure that they have a high quality of life and are able to pursue it to the best of their abilities, like we want to make sure everybody else can do as well. In addition to that, I would like to say that I want to make sure that we have adequate opportunity to have these discussions in public forums. I have been appointed to the Pierce County Aging and Disabilities Resources Advisory Board, and it's because of that intent to have this discussion in more forums and have this discussion about whole life discussions. And so as your senator, you're always going to have an open door, and it's always going to be there for as long as you need to discuss this topic. Because as I run for Senate, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. It's not something I'm ever going to forget. And it defines me as a person, as a legislator, and as a professional. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer these questions for you. And if you live in the 2nd Legislative District, I would be honored if you would grant me your vote. Thank you so much.